Hey everyone, welcome to week 7. I hope you all had a good flex week. I hope it wasn't too boring for you. This week's topic is a little bit boring, I'll be honest with you. But at least we have Tima coming this week to class to share his insights about how to run a multi-million-dollar VR studio. That's exciting, isn't it? To me, anyway. So this week we've got immersive design teams and the design pipeline. Let's start this off with a recap. So we've established a roughly workable architecture for immersive systems, which basically fits any kind of design, including live experiences like restaurants, as well as virtual reality experiences. So we've broken down all the different components that make up an immersive design, an immersive system. And guess what? We need people to make those tiny little bits too. So in other words, we need people to create the terrain, objects, and characters, for example. We need people to develop the interaction control systems, any supporting subsystems, and so on. Which is why we move on to the next recap. And this is just a reminder that our field is an interdisciplinary medium. Interdisciplinary. An interdisciplinary medium. So who do we need to create immersive experiences? We've got application developers, me, hardware engineers, experience designers, etc. Basically everyone. Now, I guess we can try and take these two slides and see if we can combine them. Where do these specializations fit in the slide 3 framework? So let's move on to the next slide. And we end up with this. So hopefully this kind of makes sense. So if we just take a look at the characters, objects, and terrain, we can see that we need 2D and 3D artists, audio specialists, architects, and coders. I'm primarily thinking about people who would be designing the environments and the characters in our immersive experience. And I'd say that's where they would fit. Maybe you'll disagree. Maybe you'll want to put some of them in the sensory feedback, for example. But I would mostly think of the people working on sensory feedback as hardware engineers. So to me, these would be the people designing the headsets, hand controllers, any kind of electric shock devices, or even the brain-computer interfaces. But they can't really design those things in a vacuum because otherwise it wouldn't work. So they're going to need biologists to figure out how our bodies actually work, and then we'll also need psychologists to figure out how we perceive certain sensory inputs and put that into context and make that work effectively. And we need coders as well to make everything working. So I'm a little bit biased. You'll probably see all around this diagram that there's coders in every single subsystem. But it's kind of true, right? You need programmers to make anything work these days, especially if they have anything to do with computers. Even a live experience like restaurants, you need people to program the iPads that take the orders and all that. And I can see where it gets annoying for non-coder people because we're pretty hard to deal with, And actually this leads into the insight that anything that needs a team, anything that needs multiple people to build towards something is going to come up with some social dynamic issues. So we need to try and optimize how people work together so we're all just not fighting all the time. And there's a whole branch of business management theory that covers this. So there's a really cool psychologist, Adam Grant, that deals with organizational psychology. But we're not going to go too deeply down that path. We'll just concentrate on how these things are dealt with mostly in a typical way in our field. But if you're interested in that, go ahead. That's still human factors. But that's a little bit of a segue. So let's just have a look at the rest of these systems. So again, state tracking systems would essentially just be sensors, and these would be the eye tracking cameras. These would be the galvanic skin response things that measure sweat, and the electrodes that go into your BCIs. And the kinds of people that are needed in this area are pretty much similar to the sensory feedback. You need the hardware engineers to actually build the sensors, and then again you need the biologists and psychologists to actually get accurate information so the sensors work, and then I guess you need the coders to put it all together. In a non-digital experience, you might need a Wizard of Oz or something like that to keep track of what the user is doing. Where are they standing? What are they touching? And so on. And you know what? In the case of theme park actors, they are both the state tracking and sensory feedback systems. So they have to act a little bit like both. So it makes sense that in this diagram, the same people could be responsible for either sensory feedback or state tracking. This goes to show how wide-ranging our field actually is. But you know who keeps it all together in this confusing mess of things? It's the interaction designers, the experience designers, and narrative designers in the interaction control systems. So this is mainly where we sit in this class, in this course. So our responsibility here is to take all the different elements that we talked about and get all those different specializations to work nicely together into some kind of coherent experience. And that leads us to the next slide. So graduates of this program would be quite well placed to be an overall director of any immersive design project. And in your professional experience, this diagram probably won't seem that unfamiliar. It's just the words are slightly different. So let's go through this diagram methodically. Now, in most projects that I know of, there's often an external stakeholder, and typically this would be the person or the organization that's paying the bills. Say, for example, the Navy or the Australian Federal Police or some other big organization that has lots of money. And typically they would be talking directly to the overall project director, telling them what they need exactly. So what are their requirements, when do they need everything finished by, and so on. It's then up to the overall project director to bring together a bunch of teams in an ideal world where you have unlimited amount of people, and then make a coherent team. And usually this team in immersive design projects would be an art director. This person would be responsible for the overall look of the thing, so they would be getting feedback from the project director about like how everything should look, but it's not that specific. Usually the director would just say these are the audience that we'd like to reach, and then the art director just comes up with a solution to fit that particular brief. And then it's good to have it this way, because if you have an overall art director, this person can then take control of the design language and the visual language of the whole project, which makes it consistent across everything. So then this person ideally should have a bunch of other people helping them, and it'll all be nice. In less ideal situations, very often the art director would just be one person. But yeah, that's a bit of a nightmare situation, because then that person would need to do everything. But at least they have complete control, which is some kind of an advantage. But not really, because they're going to end up dying because of all the work they have to do. But yeah, let's move on. So the interaction design or gameplay director. Now, in my experience, very often this is actually the same person as the overall project director. But that's not actually a great idea. In essence, there is a bit of a conflict of interest there, because if it's a commissioned project, the external stakeholders are the ones with very specific requirements. It's the job of the overall project director to get the whole project to meet those requirements. Now, if this overall project director is also the interaction designer, it's very easy for the interaction designer to try and cut corners. So straight away you have a conflict of interest. So ideally this should not be the same person. But sometimes you can't avoid that because you just don't have enough people in small teams. Especially in an emerging field like this, you don't often have a very, shall we say, deep pool of people you can pull from. But, the more interest that we gain in this field and the more people study it, maybe the situation will improve in the future. And then we have the technical director. Again, this is just a typical structure of an immersive design team. It doesn't necessarily have to be the only structure of a design team. But the job of the technical director is to basically help everyone else in the team do their job. So they might be the ones responsible for, connecting to external systems or making sure that the game engine works for the kinds of things that they're trying to do. Again, in smaller teams, it could sometimes be that the project director and technical director and the interaction design director is the same person, so that's not a great situation. So not only because of the workload, but also again because of conflict of interest issues. So basically every department or every level below will try to cut corners, and it's the job of the person above to make sure that those corners are either not cut or cut in such a way that it's not noticeable. And I guess the other issue is typically everyone in the immersive design team would have their own creative proclivities. And if you just get everyone to go in their own separate directions, you end up with a project that's not coherent. So I guess it's the job of the people further up the chain in this diagram to try and maintain that vision, try and keep people going in the same direction. Otherwise, you'll end up with an experience that's just a hodgepodge that doesn't make any sense at all. Unless that's what you're trying to go for, but it's usually not the thing that you want. Let's take a look at a typical project cycle. Again, I'm thinking of a situation where there is actually a defined customer, an external stakeholder that's usually paying for the project. But if it's not a commissioned work, if it's just purely creative or something that's direct to consumer, then we can think of the consumer as the external stakeholder. I'm just taking the corporate terminology. Let's say the public. The public in this case is the external stakeholder. Anyway, let's get back to the diagram. In a commissioned work, you would typically start off with a first meeting, like once they've decided to go with you, and you're the team that they're going to go for, and then contracts have been signed and all that. You would have an initial meeting with them where you sit down and basically nut everything out. And for anyone here that's ever been a freelancer, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because customers don't know what they want. So you need to keep asking them questions like it's like, I want this, but like they don't really know the implications of what that means. So you need to keep asking them, what do you really want? And then you might be suggesting, oh, okay, I hear what you're saying. Maybe you mean this. Do you mean this? And then you end up with a Kanban board full of what we would call epics, if you're using the Agile software development system. And an epic is just essentially a story or a phrase or a statement which exemplifies a kind of a goal for the whole project. And if you meet that, then you kind of tick that off and say, we've met it. But like one particular epic would be broken down into lots and lots of smaller subtasks and other sub-epics. So just for illustration purposes, an epic goal might be able to pick up binoculars and see other Navy ships in the binoculars, and helicopters are also flying around. Actually, that's too specific. Sometimes you'll get something a bit higher level than that. You would say, able to train Navy officers in bridge operations. And that's like, what the hell is that? So then this is where you need to rely on your customers for their domain-specific knowledge to keep asking questions. Anyway, this session might take a day or two. So it's just basically coming up with ideas, asking questions, and then writing the answers to those questions down. Once you have all this stuff, you then go back to the rest of your team and start, coming up with a concept. This would just be really rough concepts, and we'd be talking about storyboards, post-it notes, diagrams, And then once you come up with that, you then send it back again to the external stakeholder and see what they think. And it kind of just goes around in cycles. And this process can be a bit of a unpredictable. So you typically just want it to go with one cycle where you have the initial concept and it gets approved immediately. But typically you'll have to they'll tell you to change something, and then let's come back in a week and then let's look at it again. I guess if we were to take it back to a film production analogy, this would be the pre-production stage, I guess. And while we're on the topic of production, this concept ideation stage would also include timelines, basically this is what we propose, this is what we think is needed in terms of time, and these are the stages of completion. And a lot of the arguments would actually come from this. It really depends on how the initial contract was actually drafted and concluded. Anyway, you can already see it's kind of messy and chaotic, and our job here is to try and make it less messy and chaotic. So basically, once the pre-production concept ideation stage is finished and the customer approves everything, we go into production. And then it goes into a similar kind of iterative design process as the pre-production stage, except in this case you're testing real running code. If you're lucky enough to have a QA department, you would basically be sending builds to the QA department to test, and then they'll be like, these are all the bugs, these are all the interaction problems. And technical bugs aren't really that horrible. The really horrible things is when you come up with interaction issues. Like you think your initial design is perfect and great for this particular application, and then some real people actually get to try it out, and then they don't know what to do with it. So then you're going to come back and tweak it a little bit. Sometimes it's so bad that it'll get sent back to pre-production. And that's what the dotted line there is, going from internal user testing to concept ideation. But that doesn't happen very often if you're a good designer. And then also sometimes you have stakeholders that want to be part of the internal user testing as well. So that's what the dotted line is there for, the customer testing, and then it goes back up to concept production. And it really just depends on the stakeholder that you're working with. But yes, that cycle there represents the iterative design process, and after enough cycles of those, you eventually end up in a state where the project is ready for final delivery. And it depends on who gets to sign off on that. Usually, if you still have good relations with your external stakeholder by the end of this process, you would get them to do the final sign-off. And sometimes it would be stipulated in the contract that they would do the final sign-off. But sometimes there's also situations where it's the production team that gets to sign off and then say, well, we did everything in the contract, we're not going to do any more work for you unless you give us more money. Yeah, not very creative, but it's still human factors, and that's why we're talking about it. So for us, though, as immersive designers, probably the most important thing for us is our testing methods. All the politics and the turmoil can be handled by the management type people. We're the creative people. Our job is to end up making the best experience possible for the ultimate end user of this experience. And maybe this would be a trainee, like say for a mining operation or a naval officer or something like that. Yeah, essentially a real person at the end of the day. So we need to make sure that our designs are actually working for them. Really, the gold standard best practice is to gain access to the ultimate end user and getting them to do the testing for our experience. But this isn't always possible, so you end up with just internal team members. But that's still valuable, I guess. You're getting other people other than yourself to test your design, and that's the most important thing. And there's a few ways of doing this. We've already talked about Wizard of Oz in week 4, I think, when we talked about low fidelity prototyping. So that's when we have a person filling in the functionality of the immersive experience and getting the user to pretend that they're not there. The Wizard of Oz, I mean. So essentially, this is like a lot of onus on the design team. Now, the next point, the talk aloud method, is putting a lot of onus on the testing person or the tester. And essentially, this is where you ask them to just keep talking and tell us what you're thinking. The idea with this is to try and pinpoint any kind of misconceptions about the design. And we saw an example of this in class actually when Anna was showing off her prototype. And I asked, like, what do the colors mean? And that prompted her to realize that that wasn't clear. So that's the kind of insight that we want to get out in talk aloud methods. Now I'm just looking at the time and it looks like I've talked too much again. So let's wrap up. Now let's talk briefly about survey questions and behavioral mechanics. Survey questions are still valuable as testing things, but not as high resolution as just listening to someone go through your app. But the survey questions are still useful because they're scalable. So you can send a ton of people the same survey question, and then depending on how you've designed it, you can get some insights just because of the amount of data that you're bringing back in. And similar idea with behavioral mechanics, but slightly higher resolution. So another way of describing behavioral mechanics is analytics. So essentially you would just maybe count how many clicks does it take for a user to get from one menu to the other, or you try and assess whether users are actually successfully doing a specific task, or that kind of thing. And this is kind of like the best of both worlds, I guess. So the thing with the talk aloud method is that it's really, really costly. You need to spend a lot of time with one particular person, but you get a lot of information. And I guess with the survey questions, you need to send it out to lots and lots of people before it actually becomes useful. So with behavioral mechanics, it's somewhere in between. So it's kind of like talk aloud, but you don't have to keep constantly asking questions from the tester, and they don't have to keep constantly talking. They just do the thing and then you record it, and sometimes this is also enough. And it's scalable too, because you don't have to actively do anything. You just have to sit there and gather the data. Anyway, we're over time again, so I'll wrap it up. See you in class.